You think you know World War II. You've seen the movies. You've read the books. You know about D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and the Battle of the Bulge. But what you know is only half the story. The other half, the one that was stamped top secret for decades, is where things get truly insane. This is the history they don't teach you in school. I'm talking about plans so absurd they defy belief. We're going to uncover how the Allies plotted to secretly feminize Hitler, how an army of artists with inflatable tanks fooled the entire German military, and how the most important spy in the entire war was a dead body. You heard me right. Today we are diving headfirst into the declassified files to expose every World War II conspiracy theory that turned out to be shockingly real. So, get ready for a trip down the rabbit hole, because we're starting with a plan that sounds like it was cooked up by a cartoon villain. Weaponizing bats. Yes, bats. And don't think for a second this was some kind of joke. It was a genuine high-level American military project called Project X-Ray. The idea came from, of all people, a dentist from Pennsylvania named Lidl S. Adams. He was on vacation in New Mexico, visited Carlsbad Caverns, and saw the sheer biblical-scale swarm of bats pouring out of the cave. An idea sparked. What if you could attach tiny timed incendiary bombs to millions of these bats? The plan was as simple as it was insane. You'd load these bomb-strapped bats into special refrigerated containers, fly them over Japanese cities at dawn, and then just open the doors. The bats would fly out and find roosts in the dark attics and rafters of Japan's predominantly wood and paper buildings. After a while, their tiny timers would go off, and poof, thousands of simultaneous fires starting from the inside out, causing absolute chaos and overwhelming the firefighters. The military actually thought this was a genius idea. They captured thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats and started testing. The tests, however, were a complete disaster. In one infamous incident, a handful of armed bats escaped at an auxiliary airbase in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and promptly flew to the nearest hangar and roosted. A few minutes later, the entire hangar and a general's car were burnt to a crisp. They literally bombed themselves. After spending $2 million, a fortune at the time, the project was eventually scrapped in favor of a different, much more terrifying secret weapon, the atomic bomb. Still, for a moment, the fate of the war was going to ride on the wings of tiny explosive mammals. But as insane as weaponizing bats is, it's genuinely nothing compared to the story I'm saving for the end of this video. I'm talking about one of the greatest deceptions in military history, that the Allies took a random corpse from a morgue and used him to personally fool Hitler into moving entire armies. So don't you dare go anywhere. While the Americans were busy setting their own bases on fire with bats, the Japanese were working on a far more successful and terrifyingly silent secret weapon. They created thousands of fugo, or balloon bombs. These were massive hydrogen balloons about 33 feet in diameter, carrying a payload of anti-personnel and incendiary explosives. The genius of this weapon was its delivery system. Japanese scientists discovered the existence of the jet stream, a powerful ribbon of air high in the atmosphere that flows from west to east. So they just released the balloons. They floated up into the jet stream and silently drifted for 3 days across the Pacific Ocean, right over the United States. A barometric system would then trigger the release of the bombs over American soil. Between late 1944 and early 1945, over 9,000 of these balloons were launched. While most failed to reach their target, hundreds actually made it. They landed all across North America, from Alaska to Mexico. The US government, fearing mass panic, imposed a complete media blackout on the story. The only known civilian casualties occurred on May 5, 1945, when a pregnant woman and 5 children on a church picnic in Oregon stumbled upon a downed balloon and were killed when it exploded. It remains one of the strangest and least known direct attacks on the American mainland in the entire war. But if you want to talk about messing with your enemy on a whole other level, you have to talk about Operation Bernhard. This was about destroying an entire country from the inside out, using nothing but paper and ink. This was the largest currency counterfeiting operation in history, orchestrated by the German SS. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Print hundreds of millions of perfect British pounds, fly them over Britain, and just dump them out of planes. The goal was to trigger hyperinflation so catastrophic that it would make the pound worthless, shattering public confidence and completely collapsing the British economy. It would be a knockout blow without firing a single shot. To pull this off, the Nazis gathered a team of 142 Jewish and other prisoners at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp who were expert printers, engravers, and artists. Led by a master forger named Salomon Smolyanov, this team was given the impossible task of replicating Britain's complex currency. and they nailed it. The counterfeit notes were so perfect that even the Bank of England itself couldn't distinguish them from the real thing. And speaking of recognizing the genuine article, that subscribe button is looking pretty authentic right now. Click it. They replicated the specific paper, the watermarks, everything. The Germans produced over 134 million pounds, equivalent to about 15% of all genuine British currency in circulation at the time. Ultimately, they got nervous about the logistics of dropping it all from planes and decided to use it for a different purpose: funding the war. The fake pounds were used to pay spies, purchase black market materials, and finance secret operations across Europe. After the war, when the Allies found crates of the stuff, the Bank of England was forced to halt the circulation of all large denomination notes and redesign its currency completely. It was an economic conspiracy that came terrifyingly close to succeeding. From economic warfare to, well, to just plain weird. You'd think Allied intelligence would be focused on military targets, but declassified documents from the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, show they had a very, very strange obsession with Adolf Hitler's personal life. So much so that they hatched a plan to feminize him. I'm not joking. The plan was to smuggle doses of estrogen, a female sex hormone, into his food. The thinking was that if they could secretly dose him with estrogen, it would counteract his aggressive masculine tendencies. They hoped it would make him more docile, less prone to fits of rage, and maybe his voice would get a little higher. Spies actually considered this plan seriously. They thought they could bribe Hitler's personal food tasters or find a way to inject the hormones into the vegetables grown in his personal garden. The plan was, thankfully, never put into action, mostly because they just couldn't figure out a reliable way to get the estrogen onto his plate without being caught. Guys, can we just pause and appreciate that at some point a group of serious intelligence officers sat in a room and decided the best way to win the war was to give Adolf Hitler mood swings? It's utterly bizarre. So while spies on the ground were busy plotting hormonal warfare, pilots in the sky were reporting something that couldn't be explained by science or reason. It was a genuine UFO mystery decades before Roswell, and a perfect example of how the truth of this war gets weirder and weirder. All leading up to that story I promised you about the corpse that outsmarted the Third Reich. Starting in late 1944, Allied pilots flying over Germany and the occupied territories began reporting bizarre encounters with unidentified flying objects. These weren't enemy aircraft. They were described as small metallic spheres or colorful balls of light that would appear out of nowhere, tail their planes for a few minutes, and then vanish. They moved at incredible speeds and could perform maneuvers that were impossible for any known aircraft. The pilots named them Foo Fighters, a name borrowed from a popular comic strip. At first, they assumed it was a new secret German weapon, maybe some kind of radar-guided psychological weapon designed to spook them. They tried to shoot them down, but they were too fast and agile. They tried to outmaneuver them, but the objects would just toy with them before disappearing. But here's where it gets really weird. German and Japanese pilots started reporting the exact same things. They also saw these strange lights and orbs and also assumed they were a new secret Allied weapon. So if both sides were seeing them and neither side knew what they were, what in the world was in the sky? The phenomenon was so widespread that it was officially reported in major publications like the New York Times. The military launched investigations but came up with no answers. To this day, nobody knows for sure what the Foo Fighters were. Were they a natural atmospheric phenomenon like ball lightning, or were they something else entirely? It was a genuine UFO mystery, decades before Roswell. From unexplained mysteries in the sky to a horrific truth buried in the ground. Fair warning, this next one isn't bizarre or funny. We're talking about a chilling story of a war crime and a 50-year cover-up that implicated nearly all the Allied powers. I'm talking about the Katyn Forest Massacre. In April 1943, German forces occupying Soviet territory made a gruesome discovery in the Katyn Forest near Smolensk. They found a series of mass graves containing the bodies of thousands of Polish military officers, all executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head. In total, they uncovered over 4,000 corpses, but it was later revealed that the total number of murdered Polish personnel was closer to 22,000. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels immediately seized on the discovery, blaming the massacre on the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. The Soviets in turn claimed the Nazis had committed the atrocity after capturing the Polish officers. It was a classic case of he said, she said between two of the most brutal regimes in history. But here's the conspiracy. The British and American governments had evidence evidence suggesting the Soviets were in fact the culprits. The Polish government in exile provided detailed intelligence pointing to Soviet guilt based on the last known whereabouts of the officers. Yet both Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt chose to publicly support the Soviet version of events and suppress the truth. Why? Because in 1943, the Soviet Union was a crucial ally in the fight against Hitler. Admitting that their partner had systematically murdered 22,000 Polish officers would have shattered the Allied coalition and created a massive public relations disaster. So for the sake of winning the war, the truth was buried. It wasn't until 1990, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that Mikhail Gorbachev officially admitted that the Soviet NKVD had carried out the massacre in 1940. It was a cold, calculated cover-up that sacrificed justice for political expediency. But covering up one horrific truth is one thing. What about building your entire future on a foundation of lies and recruiting the very monsters you just defeated? Because that's exactly what happened next. As the war was ending, the United States initiated a top-secret program called Operation Paperclip. The mission? To find and recruit the top Nazi German scientists and bring them to America. The goal here wasn't about bringing war criminals to justice. The real mission was to beat the Soviet Union in the emerging Cold War. The US government knew that Germany's scientific and technological prowess was second to none, and they wanted that knowledge for themselves. So they scrubbed the records of hundreds of German scientists, erasing their Nazi past, whitewashing their connections to war crimes, and secretly granting them security clearance to work on America's most sensitive military and space projects. The most famous of these recruits was Wernher von Braun, the brilliant rocket scientist who had designed the V2 rocket for Hitler. The V2 was a terror weapon that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp. The rockets themselves were built using slave labor from concentration camps, where an estimated 20,000 prisoners died. But because von Braun was the world's foremost expert on rocketry, his past was overlooked. He and his team were brought to the US, where they became the foundational architects of the NASA space program, eventually putting a man on the moon. It's an uncomfortable truth. The race to space was built on a foundation of Nazi science. So America gets the Nazi scientists, but that still leaves the question of Germany itself. And if you think recruiting your enemies is cynical, the plan they almost approved for the German people is so much worse. We're getting closer to that corpse spy story, but you need to hear this first. While most plans focused on rebuilding and denazification, a much more radical and punitive idea gained serious traction at the highest levels of the US government. The Morgenthau Plan. Proposed by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. in 1944, forget about Reconstruction. This was a plan for total pastoralization. The Morgenthau Plan called for the complete and total de-industrialization of Germany. It advocated for stripping the country of all its major industries, particularly in the Ruhr Valley, which was the industrial heart of Europe. The mines would be flooded, the factories dismantled, and Germany would be forcibly converted into a pre-industrial agricultural society. The goal was to permanently eliminate Germany's ability to ever wage war again by destroying its economic capacity to do so. This plan was, for a time, seriously considered and even tentatively approved by both Roosevelt and Churchill. However, it was eventually leaked to the press and met with fierce criticism. Opponents argued that destroying Germany's economy would create a power vacuum in Central Europe, lead to mass starvation, and ultimately benefit the Soviet Union. The plan was officially rejected, but its punitive spirit heavily influenced the initial Allied occupation policies, which were far harsher than the later Marshall Plan that ultimately helped rebuild Germany. Now we come to one of the most persistent and debated conspiracies of the entire war. The idea that Winston Churchill deliberately sacrificed the city of Coventry. The story goes like this. On the night of November 14, 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched a massive, devastating bombing raid on the industrial city of Coventry. The raid, codenamed Moonlight Sonata, killed hundreds of civilians and destroyed the city center, including its historic cathedral. The conspiracy theory alleges that thanks to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who had cracked the German Enigma code, Churchill knew the exact date and target of the raid well in advance. But he made the horrifying calculation to let the raid happen without evacuating the city or mounting a full-scale defense in order to protect the priceless secret of Enigma. If the Germans realized the Allies were perfectly prepared for the raid, they would know their codes were broken. This is a gut-wrenching idea. The truth, however, is a bit more complicated, but no less terrifying. Historians who have reviewed the declassified records say that while Bletchley Park did provide intelligence that a major raid was coming, The information was not nearly as specific as the conspiracy claims. They had fragments of intelligence pointing to a raid codenamed Korn, but they didn't know for certain if that was even the real target. They knew a raid was imminent, and London, the Midlands, and the home counties were all potential targets. They just didn't have the smoking gun pointing directly to Coventry until it was far too late to mount a perfect defense. The military did take some extra preparatory steps, but nobody anticipated the sheer scale and ferocity of what was about to be unleashed. So Churchill didn't sacrifice Coventry, but he was forced to make impossible decisions based on incomplete intelligence, knowing that any action he took could tip off the enemy and cost them their single greatest advantage. And now for the story we've all been waiting for, the one that proves that in wartime, truth is not only stranger than fiction, it's more brilliant. This is Operation Mincemeat, the time the Allies used a dead body to change the entire course of the war. By 1943, the Allies were ready to invade Fortress Europe. The obvious target was Sicily, a stepping stone from North Africa into Italy. The problem was, the Germans knew it was the obvious target too. The Allies needed a way to convince the Nazi high command that they were going to attack somewhere else entirely, specifically Greece and Sardinia. They needed a deception so perfect, so audacious, that it would make Hitler personally reroute his divisions. Enter Charles Chumley and Ewan Montague, two British intelligence officers who devised a plan straight out of a spy novel. Step 1. Get a dead body. They acquired the corpse of a homeless man named Glinder Michael who had died from eating rat poison. Step 2. Give him a new identity. They transformed this anonymous man into Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, a completely fictional but painstakingly detailed persona. They gave him an ID card, a photo of a fake fiancé, ticket stubs from a London theater, and even an angry letter from his bank manager. They created a life. Step 3, and this is the genius part. They handcuffed a briefcase to Major Martin's wrist. Inside that briefcase were expertly forged personal letters between high-ranking Allied generals that just so happened to explicitly discuss plans to invade Greece and Sardinia, while making it seem like Sicily was just a feint. The final step? A Royal Navy submarine quietly surfaced off the coast of Huelva, Spain, a town known for its pro-German Spanish officials, and gently slid the body of Major Martin into the water, to be carried ashore by the tide as if from a plane crash. The Spanish authorities found the body, and just as planned, they allowed German intelligence to secretly photograph the contents of the briefcase before returning it to the British. The documents went straight up the chain of command all the way to Adolf Hitler himself. And he bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. Convinced the letters were genuine, Hitler overruled his own generals and ordered Panzer Division's troops and naval assets to be moved from Sicily to Greece. When the Allies actually invaded Sicily on July 9, 1943, they were met with far lighter resistance than expected. The deception had worked perfectly. Operation Mincemeat saved thousands of Allied lives and is arguably the single greatest act of misdirection in modern military history, all thanks to a homeless man given one last heroic mission after his death. And finally, if a corpse spy wasn't enough, how about an entire phantom army? This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known by its nickname, the Ghost Army. This was a unit of about 1,100 men, but their mission had nothing to do with fighting. Their sole purpose was to deceive. Their arsenal consisted of inflatable rubber tanks, dummy artillery pieces, and fake airplanes that looked real from the air. They had powerful truck-mounted speakers that could blast the sounds of advancing armored columns for miles. They generated phony radio traffic, creating entire fake divisions out of thin air to confuse German intelligence. But the most creative part was the acting. The unit was packed with artists, designers, and sound engineers, many recruited from New York and Philadelphia art schools. These soldiers would drive into French towns decked out in the insignia of a massive division and put on a show. They'd stroll into local cafes, talk loudly about their upcoming offensive, and make sure sure local spies overheard them. Then they would vanish overnight, leaving the enemy convinced that a 30,000-man force was massing in a location where there was nothing but empty fields. They staged more than 20 battlefield deceptions, often operating dangerously close to the front lines. Their illusions are credited with saving an estimated 15 to 30,000 American lives. It was pure weaponized creativity, an army of artists who used illusion and imagination to fool the Third Reich. So, from bat bombs to phantom armies, these operations prove that the truth of war is often far more bizarre than any conspiracy theorist could ever imagine. But if you think these secret plots were wild, they have nothing on the sheer, breathtaking incompetence of some of the men actually leading the armies. The stories of the worst generals of World War II are a whole other level of insanity. So, click on this video right here because trust me, you won't believe how close some of these guys came to losing the war for their own side.